Hi, I'm Ira Winkler, the CISO for Security, and I was asked to do a masterclass on my lessons learned from 30 years of security awareness training. And what I mean by that is not just sitting through security awareness training, which unfortunately I've done way more than I want to periodically, but at the same time, how to actually deliver security awareness training. So with that being said, let's start stepping through because you're going to see I'm kind of cynical on security awareness and the way it's done. I should say, I believe before I go on, security awareness is still an incredibly valuable tool. I wrote Security Awareness for Dummies. There is a good purpose for my book. I didn't waste a lot of my life just to write the book. Specifically, though, security awareness is a tactic, and you're going to hear this throughout the course, but it's a tactic, but we need an overall strategy to deal with what I call harmful user actions. So as we go through this, again, just remember, even though I'm going to be cynical, even though I'm going to talk about bad security awareness frequently, it has a very, very good purpose, but remember, it's a tactic within an overall strategy in how to deal with harmful user behavior. So moving on, pretty much the word seminal hasn't changed with regard to security awareness. And what I mean by that is, back in 1995, I gave a presentation that was called the seminal work in social engineering. And specifically, okay, how do we deal with preventing social engineering? And this was the 1995 Unix Security Symposium. And at the time, I never heard of it. It was in a nice location. And I thought, hey, why don't I go ahead and get my employer to send me to Salt Lake City around ski season? So I submitted for the event, and it was called the Seminal Work in Social Engineering. And in there, to prevent social engineering, I had some recommendations for what should be good security awareness and preventing social engineering. And they were essentially, don't rely upon common internal identifiers, such as, asking for employee ID numbers or social security numbers, whatever it might be. Implement a callback procedure. So if somebody asks for information and you don't know who they are, call them back at an established telephone number or whatever it is within the organization so you can verify the person's at the right place, at least just as an extra protection. Implement security awareness, identify direct computer support people and so on, create a security alert system, and periodically perform your own social engineering tests just to make sure everything is good. Then approximately in 2020, give or take, in 25 years later, I watched a webinar. And it was on social engineering because I always like to stay abreast of what's going on. And the person giving it was a really well-qualified social engineering expert. And I sat there and I watched the presentation. And what shocked me was when I looked at what the recommended countermeasures for social engineering were 25 years later. They coyly said, be paranoid. In other words, implement common internal identifiers, double check, train client-facing staff. In other words, give a security awareness program, verify identity with other information. In other words, you don't rely upon common internal identifiers. And the only thing new, implement multi-factor authentication, which became something relatively new since 25 years came by. So think about this. In 25 years, the state of the art, what seminal means with regard to security awareness preventing social engineering has not improved pretty much. So anyway, going on, again, how did I become cynical and maybe even an expert on security awareness and social engineering? And I'm going to start with what's wrong first, because if I don't tell you what's wrong first, there's too many misperceptions out there, and I can't tell you what's right without telling you what's wrong, because if you've heard, what's the word, common sense, common knowledge, accepted positions and everything, a lot of these accepted positions are so wrong. So anyway, let's go on with that. First, let's talk about NSA, a place I worked with for a pretty long time. And NSA, world's leader in cybersecurity, and keep this in mind. They have, when you started out at NSA, and let me start working my way through. So, when you start out at NSA, you went through 3 days of security awareness training. Think about that, 3 days of security awareness training. And you would think they pretty much cover everything. But let's start off with something that I did. At the National Security Agency, when I started there, they got a whole bunch of new desktop computers, in other words, terminals for everybody. And they had all the terminals loaded with the Xenix operating system. For those of you who don't know what Xenix is, just imagine Unix from Microsoft. And I'm not making that up. But anyway, what happened was with all these computers, they came with the software all boxed up, attached, or basically stored with the computers. So just in case you needed something, the software was there. And for those of you that don't know how a PC works, which I'm sure most of you do, if you have the installation disk and put it in the computer and reboot the computer with the installation disk, you have super user privileges. So anyway, NSA basically gave everybody super user privileges on any one of these computers, 20,000 plus computers scattered throughout the building, physically right there with them. So think about that as a nice little security measure with NSA, world's leader in cybersecurity. Next one, I don't know how many people know what this monstrosity is, but this is Charles de Gaulle Airport, what I think is the worst airport in the world, and nobody can convince me otherwise. I was once traveling for NSA doing work in Europe. I can't tell you what type of work in Europe, of course, but I was sitting there with a few coworkers, and we were waiting for our next flight because we transferred at Charles de Gaulle Airport. And one of my coworkers just started talking about work, and I'm like, shut up, shut up, shut up, shut up. And he just wouldn't stop talking. And he starts talking to like this woman next to him who we started chatting. And this woman's like, asked the natural question. So where do you work? And this guy all of a sudden froze up because he realized he should not say, I work for NSA in the middle of Charles de Gaulle Airport after he was complaining about it for like 15, 20 minutes. So anyway, all of a sudden he shut up, which was the worst possible thing to do. So I just reached over, I just kind of leaned in and said Department of Defense, which is kind of what people say if they work at NSA. And the woman, coincidentally, her husband worked for a defense contracting firm, and she knew not to ask questions. But if she didn't, that would have been really, really bad. But he should have known better. But that's kind of security awareness failings. Then this insignia, this is the insignia for U.S. Army Europe. With U.S. Army Europe, what essentially happened was a lot of work I did. Obviously, if I'm transferring in Charles de Gaulle Airport, I was working with people throughout Europe. So anyway, when I was doing this work with U.S. Army Europe, we were installing a new system for some military on a military base. And what happened was we put in the new system overnight, and then in the morning we came back, and some guy came up to us, and I was there with my friend Tony. And Tony, he made Sheldon Cooper, if you're familiar with Big Bang Theory, look like a people person. And so this person comes up, military person, and goes, are you the computer guys? I go, yeah. He's like, well, your system sucks. It's too slow. It doesn't do what we need it to do when we want it to do it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then Tony turns to the guy. I don't understand what sucks means. What specifically do you mean by sucks? Because I can't fix sucks. And I'm sitting there thinking, okay, and I had to translate for Tony. I go, Tony, the system is functioning at an unacceptable performance level. And Tony then says, oh, well, the reason for that is the semaphores inherent in the Unix operating system require a lot of overhead and therefore a lot of drag, which has latent. I'm like, then after Tony was finished, the guy just looked back at me. I go, there's nothing we could do about it. And the guy says, oh, okay. And he walks away. And that's the type of information where security people are talking to these others, to the users, without speaking their language. And we need to understand this. Then there's Edward Snowden. And I mean, I could go on about Edward Snowden for a while, but he's not the computer genius that people like to portray him as, and he likes to portray himself as. The way Edward Snowden was able to get access to all the information he got access to was not because of some super hacking abilities, but because all he did was lie to his coworkers, who were all systems administrators, and he asked them for their passwords, making up some. Sorry, I'm trying not to curse with regard to Snowden, but basically he said he was working on a special project and therefore he needed to have access to their passwords, and they gave him the passwords. And that's how he got access to so much information, by accessing the accounts of other systems administrators who knew and trusted him. Anyway, then we have when I was working at NSA in my first office, when I was working rotating shifts, and when I was on the day shift, part of my job was training new analysts who came in. And one of the analysts who came in, her last name was Kirk. I'm not going to give her first name, but her last name was Kirk. So I'm sitting there telling her how to use the systems that we work on. And I start saying, okay, log into the system. Okay, great. Now you have to log on to the database. Your database ID is going to be your last name, Kirk, K-I-R-K. Now enter your password, Captain, C-A-P-T-A-I-N, which was really a joke. And she turns at me, looking at me in horror, going, how do you know what my password is? And I just looked at her like, you gotta be kidding. And she's like, no, Captain's really my password. I'm like, okay. And then she's like, oh, and by the way, my father was in the Army. At one point, he was a captain, so there really was a Captain Kirk. I'm like, whatever. Now, this woman seems like a blithering idiot, but she's not. She was an Ivy League graduate, ironically. And what happened was, you stop and think, who's the idiot? The fact of the matter is, like I told you, she just got finished sitting through 3 days of security awareness training. And in that 3 days, nobody ever stopped her from thinking Captain would be a good idea for a password on an account of Kirk. So now let's talk about some good stuff. And this, frankly, this good story was a nightmare for me, but what happened was, like I just mentioned, I was working 24-hour rotating shifts. And when you were on the mid shift, we had to obviously do our work. And so what happened was, we had to work with a mechanical plotter. We had, every time we saw different types of military units, we had to draw a map of the unit. And we had this mechanical plotter, kind of like, well, right now it's a 3D printer type of thing. Just imagine an arm that moves slowly. And when we used it, I had to take my badge off. So I would take my badge off, I'd use the plotter, put out a report, and then in the one case, I had to go running to the restroom. So anyway, I took my badge off. I forgot my badge. Anyway, I didn't even realize it, ran to the restroom. And as I was in the hallway, a guard's doing the rounds. And I get back there and the guard's like, oh, where's your badge? I'm like, I guess I left it by my desk. He's like, well, we're going to your desk. And I go, you're not allowed anywhere near my desk, which he wasn't. And he's like, I'll wait by the door. So he follows me to the door. I go in the office and I'm looking around for my badge. And then my coworker, after a while, turns to me and goes, Ira, are you looking for something? I'm like, realizing this, I'm like, where is my effing badge? He's like, do you mean the badge that's always supposed to be around your neck at all points in time while you're in this facility? I go, give me my effing badge. And the guard's like, is there a problem in there? So anyway, finally gave me my badge. And do you think I ever forgot that badge again? The sign is, this was a cultural issue to support and reinforce good security practices. So that's actually a good thing, despite the fact I hate the guy to this day, although he did give me a good story for it. So, and then let's face it, at NSA, there's a lot of really, really screwed up people. Don't think that just because they have a clearance, they're perfect people. They are not. But despite this, there's actually relatively few incidents of security failings at NSA. Yes, we do have traitors like Edward Snowden and a couple other people, but the reality is there's generally good security practices that when there is the failing, it becomes the exception that really horrifies people, not the rule, like which happens in most places throughout business and industry. Now, let's talk about, I call it the sacred cow slaughterhouse. A lot of things that people believe is so common sense within the cybersecurity community regarding security awareness, but we really have to dispel the myths for all the reasons that I previously laid out. So let me first start off and say social engineering does not qualify you as a security awareness expert. A lot of people think, hey, you know what? If I go ahead and they'll say, you're a really good social engineer, we want you to come back and train our people on how to do it. And social engineers, and this is what I did. Yes, I made my reputation breaking into banks, stealing billions of dollars of intellectual property and everything by walking around doing social engineering. And they're like, that's great. Come back, tell our people how you did it so they know how not to fall for these things in the future. So I would go ahead, I'd give these presentations, and then they would have me come back and do a retest. And it was just as bad, if not worse, frequently when I went back to those organizations. And here's the problems. You can't just tell people, here's what I did. Don't fall for that. Think of it this way. It's really easy to break a light bulb. Just because you can break a light bulb, they're like, wow, you really broke that light bulb incredibly quickly, really efficiently. Now, okay, now go fix it because you broke it. It's clearly easy to fix. A human being is so much more complicated than a light bulb. It's so much more complicated than a computer. Why do you think then, just because you can break a human being, using the analogy, that you can fix the human being? It takes a completely different set of skills to break something than to fix it, especially when we're talking about people. It's easy to abuse people. Anybody can abuse a person. But the reality is it takes so much more intelligence and science to get a person to do the right thing on a consistent basis within the limitations you have. A social engineer frequently doesn't have limitations. They don't have budget limitations. They don't have time limitations. They don't have logistical or political limitations frequently. You have those limitations. So it takes a completely different skill set than being a social engineer who can abuse people. At the same time, I see a lot of people, it's like, oh, I took a course on neuro-linguistic programming, so I'm an expert. Yeah, neuro-linguistic programming is helpful. It helps you relate to people and be a good person. It's not a substitute for nation-state level human elicitation training. I keep saying that good spies have a sixth sense. I once had a friend who I would bring girlfriends to, and I'd say, what do you think of her? What do you think of her? And things like that. And he's like, oh, and he'd be able to read them in a heartbeat. One of my friends, Stan was a colonel in Russia's GRU, their military intelligence group, the people who are referred to as the evil twin of the KGB. And Stan was a spy master, and his life depended upon what people would think was an intuition. I will tell you a story I don't frequently tell, but there was one time where we were breaking into an organization, legitimately breaking in. Stan was on my team, as was Stu. Stu's a former Navy SEAL, Stan's a former Russian spy and everything. And we were having massive success, breaking into this company. And during the course, the person we reported to, the CISO, said, you should report to the chief security officer who will work physical security and also executive protection, and talk to him. So anyway, we went through, and it turns out when we were talking to the CSO, he was a former deputy director of the Secret Service, and he seemed to obviously have a good, trustworthy background. And we talked to him. And during the conversation, Stu, former Navy SEAL, one of the most ethical people I ever met in my life, he was telling them that at a previous organization that he worked for or did consulting for, that was actually in their geographic region, that they had some incident previously where people were taking the decorative rocks they had outside their window, threw it through a window, and then ran in and stole a computer that contained a lot of PII, personal identifiable information, of their employees. And that what he recommends for this company, which also had nice decorative rocks, to put a special type of glass protector, like pretty much a film that prevents windows from shattering. So anyway, that seemed normal. So then the next day we're driving around and, Stan's in the car next to me, Stu's in the back seat as I'm driving. I get a call, it's the CISO. And the CISO was telling me, well, I have to talk to you. We just, I'm here with the CSO and we're very concerned. And I expected him to say about Stan, because Stan, Russian spy, I can understand people being concerned about a Russian spy stealing their stuff, having massive success. Instead, he goes, we're very concerned about Stu. And I was like, Stu, are you sure you mean Stu? He's like, yeah, we mean Stu. Stu was talking about one of his other clients, and we're afraid he's going to talk about us to future clients. I'm like, that incident he spoke about was a public incident that became known throughout the world, and frankly, was especially known and discussed in InfraGard meetings in your local area that your people should be familiar with. And he's like, well, we're very concerned, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, finally hang up because, it was absurd to me. And Stan just turns to me and goes, told you so, in his thick Russian accent. And I remember that to this day. Stan had a sixth sense because when we walked out, Stan's like, I don't trust this person. And I was like, why wouldn't you not trust a former Secret Service director? He's like, I don't trust him. And he proved us right the next day. And it was lesson to be learned. You can't just take a security, an NLP course. Let me tell you again, I mentioned how breaking a light bulb is not the same as fixing a light bulb. Getting someone to give up a password or giving you general information is not the same as getting people to betray their country under penalty of death and torture. This is what people like Stan were trained for. Yes, taking an NLP course is nice, it's helpful, but don't think that you can all of a sudden take one course and be an expert that replaces trained human intelligence operatives who pretty much, I don't necessarily think they have their sixth sense, but they are trained really, really well. Now, I once heard the expression, and I now wrote a book, You Can Stop Stupid, but there was that title was taken off an expression I heard that you can't patch stupid. Yes, you can patch stupid. That is your job as a security professional. I'm going to say you can't stop people from being stupid. You have to expect people to make mistakes. But to me, stupid are security people who don't expect users to make mistakes. We have to expect users to make mistakes, to give up their passwords, to do something malicious. But what that means is, as cybersecurity professionals, we must go ahead and, yes, give them some better awareness training, but we have to expect, quote unquote, stupid. And by that, I mean, we have to go ahead proactively and implement technical precautions, procedural precautions that say we anticipate a user will do something stupid, but we prevent that proactively. We try to take decisions away when we can, but we also proactively anticipate the mistakes and put other protections in there, such as limiting access to users, such as expecting data leak prevention to be necessary, such as not giving people unlimited abilities on the network for their mistake to propagate throughout the network. It is your job as a cybersecurity professional to patch stupid. Patching doesn't mean that you stop it from existing. Patching means that it happens and you proactively anticipate it and prevent the harm from resulting from it. Now, here's the other, and that's a kind of a corollary. You, as a cybersecurity professional, not the users, are the weakest link. And, I have the statement, behind every stupid user is a stupider security professional. And think about it. For these things, for a user to be damaging, we give them the ability to damage. We don't put preventions in place for damage to be realized. That is on the cybersecurity professional, not the user. The user is not the weakest link. The system around the user, the protections around the user are the weakest link. And you who are responsible for implementing those protections are the weakest link. And as I tell people, and I've said this before, if a user can click on something and ruin your network, Your network sucks. It's not the user, it's your network. Get over it. So also, and here's one of the things that bother the hell out of me. I hear expressions like users are your first line of defense, users are your last line of defense, and so on. And people have all these grandiose terms. We don't want to disparage the user. And then it's sort of like, wait a second, if a user is aware, can stop an attack, you're saying if something happens because the user's unaware, that's actually blaming the user anyway. So you got to start to think, wait a second, what is the first line of defense? Users are never your first line of defense. For example, a phishing message. For a phishing message to get to the user, the first line of defense is the internet that theoretically allows these bad messages to occur, but that has failed. Then your second line of defense is your network. Like your network perimeter. If you're using DMARC, perhaps that would stop phishing messages from existing. Then you have your secure email gateway. Then you have the email, phishing prevention on the endpoints and so on. Your user is not your first line of defense. The user is one point among many points in a chain of events. And they're not your first line of defense. Likewise, your users are part of the overall system. They are not a resource for the security team. Yes, we expect users to be secure as part of their job to the best of their ability, but they are not your resource. They are something that you have to account for as part of the system. So anyway, consider that as we move on, but they're never your first line of defense. You're allowing the attacks to get to them. That is on you. The human firewall, one of the biggest pet peeves I have are people calling things the human firewall. Regular firewalls suck. Why do you think a human firewall is any better? A firewall has technology in place to consistently do and allow different things to pass. A user is not a piece of equipment. A user is not allow, disallow, whatever the case may be. They're unreliable. Stop with this term. But more important, the real reason I hate the term human firewall is that it creates the impression you are trying to create perfection in your users. You're never going to create perfection in your users. Users will never be perfect. And if you say, I'm going to create the human firewall, the first time a user fails, your human firewall has failed and you have failed. You are trying to reduce risk from user actions. You're not trying to ideally you want perfection, but by implying you're going to give perfection, you look like a fool, and rightfully so. Here's another one. Yes, you can blame the user. And I get very aggravated when I hear, oh no, we can't blame the user. I was once on a panel, an ISACA panel. It was a keynote panel at ISACA Europe or something like that. And, I was on there and they're like, oh, well, you're blaming the user. You can't blame the user when we were talking about something. I'm like, why not? And the person replies, well, you can't. I'm like, why? It's like, well, you can't. I'm like, no, you can blame the user. If a user does something legitimately wrong, for example, something out of policy, and I'll give you one quick example. This was true. I once got called to investigate an incident because a guard working late night shifts in the guard shack that allows people in and out of a facility, the guard decided he wanted to watch movies on the PC, on the guard shack PC. And what he did was he installed some software that essentially bypassed the security, essentially created a VPN to like Netflix or whatever it was. And in the process, he downloaded malware, which took down the system. How could you not blame the user? Yes, you don't want to blame the user. And I should say in safety science, there are things that's known as a just system. In a just system, you blame the user if they do something that's out of policy. However, if you have given the users the direction that they need, the proper direction, if you've given them the proper training and how to do what the direction is properly, you've given them the proper resources to do it properly, and you haven't overburdened them with other responsibilities that makes them want to bypass proper procedures, you blame the user. We have users who do malicious things. We have users who intentionally bypass policies and procedures. We have users who just ignore what we do. You blame them, because if you don't enforce the policies you have and provide the proper punishments for people who are going clearly outside the scope of their work, who are bypassing their responsibilities that are clearly stated and doable, then you have no policies to implement. You need enforcement. And yes, you can blame the users if you provide them with a just system. And if you don't provide them with a just system, that's clearly on you. But if there is a just system, you blame them. And I'm not saying if they make a mistake, you blame them. What happens is everybody makes mistakes. Things happen. But you can't go ahead and blindly say you can't blame the user when we have users who frequently, intentionally do something that's clearly wrong. Next, one of the expressions in the cybersecurity industry that one of the groups put out is stop, think, and connect. I'm like, just don't do it. Stop, think, and connect, popular campaign. The problem is you're essentially trying to get the average person in implementing awareness programs to stop and think and make the connection. The problem is you're essentially relying on awareness by having them think it through. The problem is I see too often there are skilled sociopaths out there. There are trained cyber criminals. There are nation state hackers out there. These people are expert at what they do. And if you're going to take a new employee whose first responsibility in the workplace and basically saying, Mr. New Employee or Miss or whoever, you are responsible for protecting the organization against all things harmful, that is just not going to work. It's a losing equation. Skilled sociopaths will find a way around the stop, think, and connect. You need to train people what to be on the lookout for, but you have to stop training people to look out for the wascally wabbit, as I put it. For those of you that don't know the reference, that's Bugs Bunny on the screen. Bugs Bunny was always being hunted by Elmer Fudd. And Bugs Bunny would outsmart Elmer Fudd frequently by putting on a wig and a dress. And Elmer Fudd couldn't recognize Bugs Bunny if Bugs Bunny put on a disguise, which was kind of pathetic when you think about it. The reality, though, is this is what we're doing with our users. We're training people to be on the lookout for the wascally wabbit, Bugs Bunny. Be on the lookout for the hacker. The hacker's going to try to trick you. What happens when the hacker comes in a different way? What happens when they come in as a theoretical trusted source? You can't rely on this. You're essentially training people to be Elmer Fudds, as I say. Here's the critical thing. Gamification does not mean a game. Too many people think gamification is a great tool to use for security awareness programs. But too many people think gamification means, oh, I created a fun game for people to get together and play. No, that's a game. That's not gamification. Gamification is a well-established business discipline where you're essentially creating a reward system. And what I mean by that is you catch people doing the right behavior and rewarding them for behaving properly. Now, I have frequent flyer cards here. The reason I have frequent flyer cards is frequent flyer programs are a perfect example of gamification. So what does a frequent flyer program strive to do? It strives to get people to be loyal to a single airline. Also, many airlines make a lot of money by going ahead and having partner credit card programs where you have the Delta Airlines Sky Miles card from American Express, and Delta Airline gets rewarded with a lot of money from American Express, so they give you more miles. And what this means is over a period of time, you are essentially flying Delta Airlines, and I'm a Delta Airlines flyer, not as a commercial, but I fly Delta Airlines because I get rewards. I fly Delta Airlines because I get upgraded more frequently. The more I fly Delta Airlines, the more I get rewarded, the more I can earn free travel. I don't have their credit cards, but people who use the credit card get other benefits. And this is what they're trying to do. They are rewarding you for the behavior. I don't know specifically what the programs are, what they do and all that. All I know is I do the right things, I get more miles, I get more upgrades, et cetera, et cetera. That's gamification. It is not, Ira, take a quiz on what benefits do you get as you move from a silver medallion member to a gold medallion member. That's not gamification. That might be a game, but it's not rewarding me. It's not going to encourage me to fly more. Anyway, then I have a big thing. In cybersecurity, everybody talks about fun, engaging videos. Funny does not equate to effective. Doesn't mean funny can't be effective. I use the example Gomer Pyle. So I was in the U.S. Marine Corps going through officer candidate school. And here, oh, by the way, if you don't know who Gomer Pyle is, I hate you. But anyway, that aside, Gomer Pyle was a show that basically was about Gomer Pyle, a Marine recruit who went through basic training and was like a private, and Sergeant Carter was his, sergeant, and he would always yell at Gomer Pyle for doing whatever. And when I was in the Marines, one of the things we had to do was we were told we were issued our rifles, and we're sitting there practicing, taking them apart, putting them back together, like so on. And then all of a sudden out of nowhere, this disembodied voice of my drill instructor all of a sudden rings out as we're practicing in the barracks. You lose your rifle, you will do jail. And he walks out. And I'm like, what the hell was that? And then years later, I'm like, that was the best security awareness program I ever experienced in my life. Because what was he saying? We were responsible for the rifle. If we ever lost that rifle, we will suffer significant consequences. There was one person in my platoon when we were on one of our, let's just say we call it forced march. They call it a conditioning hike, pretty much the same thing. And somebody broke their leg. I mean, to the point where the bone was sticking out when they cut their trousers up. And what happened was they were putting him in the ambulance, literally with a bone sticking out of his leg. And he's like, get me my rifle, get me my rifle. And the sergeant instructor came over and started cursing. And he's like, shut up, get in there. We'll take care of your rifle. They were so scared to lose their weapons because of this awareness lesson. What would have happened if they just went ahead and had Gomer Pyle? And because Marine Corps loved Gomer Pyle, they would do Gomer Pyle production crew would have done anything. They could have gone ahead and have Gomer Pyle walk into Sergeant Carter and say, golly, Sergeant Carter, I lost my rifle. I looked everywhere, lost it. And Sergeant Carter would yell at him and everything and say, where'd you leave it? It's like, I went over. It's like, where'd you leave it? Where's the last place you had it? And et cetera, et cetera. Then finally, they probably have 2 or 3 minutes of looking in places, looking under beds, looking everywhere funny. And then Gomer Pyle walking in 2 minutes later, say, gee, Sergeant Carter, it was right where you said, right where I left it, right where you left it, just like you said. And everybody would be like, oh, that was funny. Didn't have to be funny. 5 seconds of you lose your weapon, you will do jail was the most effective training there was. You don't need funny. Funny can be distracting and a waste of time. So some examples, you lose your weapon, you will do jail. When I was at, RSA, where I originally gave this presentation, if you lose your badge at RSA, you have to pay $100 for a replacement. It basically means that RSA has people making sure they don't lose their badge. And there's extra incentive that if you leave it in a hotel room, you're not going to have to go back. You're going to go back and get the badge. Don't just walk in and claim you lost it and then potentially give your badge to a friend, which is another concern they theoretically have. There's some places where if you don't badge in, you don't get paid because badging in is a way they keep track of people's time. And if you don't wear your badge, again, you don't get paid. That's another example of incentive. If you email out PII, you will be called into the office. And why is that? Laws require it now. Loss of PII is a reportable offense. How it happens is also reportable because, again, it can cost companies a lot of money. I created this concept of a sommelier versus grandma. And the way I do that, for example, in training and security awareness training, everybody has these fine points. They try to put everything together. I don't know how my friends, a lot of my friends are wine connoisseurs, and I talk to them about the wine, and they go ahead and like a sommelier, they'll talk to you about what type of wine, what type of food and everything like that. And I once had them explain, it's like, look, the difference between a good bottle of wine and a bad bottle of wine is about 3 seconds. I'm like, what do you mean? They're like, okay, if you go to a store, buy a bottle of wine, it'll probably taste okay. You take a sip of it, it stays on your palate, give or take maybe 3 to 5 seconds. I'm like, okay, fine. Then he's like, but you have a sommelier come out, you get a nice expensive bottle of wine, maybe it'll stay on your palate for 5 to 8 seconds. And all of this fancy stuff is just buying you an extra 5 seconds of time. So creating funny videos, creating engaging videos, at the end of the day, what that does is it reduces what's known as the forgetting curve. It has you essentially saying, I remember this a little bit longer, stays on your palate for just a little bit longer. So instead of forgetting within 3 days, maybe you forget what you learned in 15 days, so on. However, I look at another type of awareness training, and that was when I visited my grandmother. And I'm sure everybody has their own version of their grandmother or other relative, but you would visit grandma's house and everybody would say, okay, here's what you do. When you get to your grandmother's house, you essentially go in there. You don't hug your grandma outside the door. You wait till you get inside the door because grandma thinks it's bad luck if you hug people outside. So you go inside and hug her. Then you basically take off your shoes when you get there so you're not walking around the house. And then when you sit down, you wait for grandmother to pick up her fork and everything like that. And everybody has these rules. However, the thing is, did I ever have to be provided with a funny video on how to behave at my grandma's house? The answer is no. Other people don't. What happens is all your other relatives are enforcing the rules. They're creating the awareness. The culture is the awareness training. It's like going to grandma's house. There's a culture involved, and that is how you behave. And everybody knows it. And if you don't know it, you learn it really quickly just by watching people, or they will tell you over time. That's the most effective training, not to get a very fine awareness program where you figure out for an extra few days how you stay more aware. There's another thing I have, and you basically have to say this properly, but there's the concept of shoulds and musts. If something's a must, you do it. If something's a should, you kind of do it when it's all, when it's convenient. And the problem is awareness programs basically should all over people. They're like, you should do this, you should do that. The problem is they're not trying to enforce good behaviors. You don't see people, for example, like something I'm going to have to deal with in a few days are travel expense reports. Nobody ever says, hey, Ira didn't fill out his travel expense report. Just give him a bunch of money he says we owe him. That doesn't work. I have to fill out the expense report to the details required with the required receipts, or I don't get reimbursed. Everything gets held up. It's not a good thing. There are a whole bunch of requirements on how to get paid, how to do whatever. But with cybersecurity, it's like, oh, you should have a good password. What about must have a good password? You shouldn't take work home with you. We're dealing with that as I record this in the United States, where apparently a few presidents and vice presidents decided to take some documents home with them. Not a good thing. It's not a should. There are musts and must be enforced. When you portray something like a should, it gets done after everything else gets done. So make it things a must. Your awareness program should not be, oh, we'd like you to do this. We'd like you to do that. It's a good idea to do this. No, all employees must wash their hands before returning to work. That's what the sign says. Things have to be a must, not a should, or it really doesn't get done. Likability is not a valid awareness metric. I see a lot of people talking about how awareness materials, how vendors will tell you, oh, 95% of people enjoy our training videos. I'm like, okay, so basically 95% of people would rather watch your videos than doing their actual job responsibilities. I don't look at that as a good thing. There have to be motivation. Liking something and taking action on it is a completely different story. We care, again, about effectiveness, not funny, not likable, not how engaging. Engagement doesn't mean effective. At the end of the day, you have to change behavior. And if you're one an awareness metric, the metric you need to do is behavioral change. Now let's go, why awareness? It's a very important question. And it's like, oh, well, we need awareness. Most of the time it's just because it's compliance. Other times there's a distinct purpose to it. Here's the one thing you really have to understand. Awareness is a business function. Awareness training is supposed to reduce risk. Cybersecurity professionals, and I don't know if I cover this later, but cybersecurity professionals of all types are supposed to reduce risk. If you are an awareness professional or have an awareness responsibility, your responsibility is to reduce risk from harmful employee behaviors. That, at the end of the day, is what it is. Now, it can also be just to check a box. And I hate to say checking a box is a legitimate business responsibility, but it is. For example, for compliance purposes, PCI compliance, LGPD, GDPR, all these other sorts of regulations around the world, you have to have awareness training. And yes, you need to check the box. Now, the thing is, to me, the only thing that matters at the end of the day is, do you have a return on investment? That's what really awareness training should be. Can you show that you have reduced risk from user activity by implementing an awareness program? Awareness should be judged as a business function, not how funny your videos are. And I hate to say it, but again, sometimes check the box is a legitimate business function. But at the end of the day, you're supposed to reduce overall risk to the business by having better or reduced harmful user behaviors. Here's another thing I say to CISOs, and here's what I say to awareness people. Security efforts get the budgets that they deserve, not the budgets that they need. That's especially true for awareness. You are going to get the budget that you deserve. Now, it doesn't mean you get the budgets that are required for a comprehensive program. But if you portray as creating the human firewall, which is going to be inconsistently good, then you are going to get a pathetic budget. At the same time, if you can go ahead and say, by implementing these type of awareness programs, I'm going to reduce risk by X amount, you can then go ahead with a specific statement and say, I need X amount of money to reduce Y amount of money. Y amount of money is exponentially greater than X. Therefore, this is the budget I need to reduce the amount of risk in the organization. And it goes beyond just checking the box. You're providing a cost benefit back to them. You got to learn to deserve more by going ahead and cost justifying your awareness budget by telling them what is the financial return on investment. Then let's talk about sciences that really don't seem to work. I call it bro science of awareness, things that are speciously true. Bro science is a term you hear in gyms where, it's like, drink more protein, bro, eat more protein, you grow more muscle. Not exactly true. It's like everybody says it, so people think it's true. Why? Because it looks like it works, but it really doesn't work for the reasons people think. And when you try to make it work in circumstances where it's not relevant, you have problems. First one is psychology. And everybody's like, ask me, why do you think psychology is not really as relevant? I'm like, psychology is the study of the individual. A lot of individuals are different. Even, for example, Myers-Briggs type indicator. Myers-Briggs type indicator breaks people down into 16 different personality types. Some people complain about it as a valid psychological measurement tool, but either way, it addresses the principle that there are multiple psychological personality types. And every person has a different way of learning in their different personality types. Now, the thing is, if you look at psychology, if I'm going to go to every individual and understand how they think, what is the best way they learn, psychology has a principle to it. Unfortunately, when I implement an awareness program, I'm trying to implement a program across the entire organization. And I have to figure out the best program for organizational design, not the best program for individual design. So that's a different science. But with psychology, yes, it helps to understand how individuals think and differ, but you can't design your entire program based upon doing something unique for every individual. Neuro-linguistic programming. Everybody loves to talk about NLP, and generally how you influence people. With neuro-linguistic programming, you're supposed to figure out how to relate to people and convince them how to do things, that you want them to do in a good way, ideally. But fundamentally, it makes security behaviors a should. And what I mean by that is you're trying to influence people. You're not trying to tell somebody, you must fill out a time card. It doesn't matter what the individual thinks. If you don't fill out a time card, you don't get paid. But if you're trying to say, look, it's to your benefit, to fill out a time card, do you know how frequently you're going to get a time card filled out? It's not going to happen. Not because NLP isn't a good science in general, but because there are competing concerns. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But more important, neuro-linguistic programming is, how do you manipulate people? You really aren't trying to manipulate people with awareness. You're trying to get them to do the right things. But neuro-linguistic programming is, again, about dealing with people one-on-one, which, like I mentioned before, psychology really doesn't work. And again, neuro-linguistic programming, trying to manipulate somebody, again, it's the same thing I mentioned before. Just because you know how to break a light bulb doesn't mean you know how to fix it. Just because you can convince somebody to do something doesn't mean they're going to do it securely. Mental models are something that don't really help. Mental models are, how do you perceive the way the world works? When I pick up a TV control, I have a mental model of a TV control, even though it's not my TV controller. The red button, there should be a red button on every TV controller, and press the red button, that's the on-off switch. There should be a channel up or channel down switch. There might be a volume switch with this little triangle on it, which indicates as you press it up, the volume goes up. As you go down, the volume goes down. That's the purpose of the triangle. That's my mental model of how a TV remote control is supposed to work. Unfortunately, with cybersecurity, mental models have been shown to be wrong. For example, if I think a lot of people have this mental model that a hacker is a computer genius, that's not really true. A hacker is just a person who knows how to exploit fundamental flaws in the system that usually result from bad hygiene. But people don't understand it. Their mental model is a hacker's unstoppable, so therefore anything I do isn't going to help. That's not a helpful mental model. You have to understand this. So most people have the wrong mental model of cybersecurity, so it can be damaging. You do have to create the right mental model. But if you're working with mental models and you're accepting mental models as they are, it's going to be harmful to your cybersecurity program. Here's some sciences that do work, however. First things are what I call the ABC of behavioral science and applied behavioral science. And then you have an antecedent drives behavior. A behavior creates consequences. The consequences then go back and reinforce the behaviors. So antecedent, behavior, consequence, ABC. Now, antecedent is essentially information. And I'll go back to the typical, don't put your hand over the flame. The flame is hot, it will burn you. That's information. That only impacts 20% of possible behavior change. So what happens is, yeah, I hear it, but you know what? Sometimes I have an accident and, I think logically I shouldn't burn my hand, or wait, do I really believe it? So I'm going to accidentally burn my hand. That's the resulting behavior. And what happens is, once I have that burn on my hand, the consequence is painful. That's going to impact 80 or more % of my future behavior. So even though I know I'm going to be much more careful around an open flame, as an example, or an electric burner, it modifies my behavior more impressively. Now, here's the thing. Consequences can have a positive, negative, or neutral effect. So let me give you a common one. We tell our users, don't reuse your passwords. Reusing your passwords is bad. Well, what happens? Users will reuse their passwords. And what's the consequence for that? Very frequently, there's no consequence to it. Frankly, it's probably a positive consequence because that's one less password for them to remember in the future. It makes their life easier. Now, what happens? I tell them don't reuse a password. They still do it. There's no harm to them in any way, shape, or form. So they are going to reuse their passwords again and again and again because there's no obvious harm to them. On the other hand, if, for example, their account gets hacked and they're, through a reused password, yes, then they will go ahead and have a new password. But until that happens, they're going to go ahead and reinforce bad behaviors. And you've got to understand that if you just give people information and they exhibit a behavior, they're going to do whatever the behavior is. Or if you tell somebody, I want you to do something, and they have to go through trouble or consequences. In other words, it's painful for them and annoying for them to keep doing it, and there's no really good consequence for it, they're going to go back and start doing the potentially harmful thing later. ABCs of awareness. Awareness creates behavior. Behaviors practiced consistently create the culture. The culture creates awareness. The culture creates the behavior. The culture's peer pressure. If you remember the story I told at the beginning of the session where when I worked at NSA, my coworker hid my badge when I forgot my badge as I ran to the restroom, that's an example of, yes, I knew what to do. The behavior, I exhibited the behavior, and everybody, frankly, at NSA wore their badge. And so that was the culture. But then what happened, since everybody wore their badge and I forgot my badge, it became a fun prank. And I use the word fun prank sarcastically for my coworker to hide my badge. So the culture basically created the awareness, created and reinforced the behavior. Again, that's the use of peer pressure. Peer pressure can be the most effective form of awareness. People don't need to sit through a video when everybody around them is exhibiting the proper behavior by default. Now we have gamification. Gamification, like I said, can be incredibly valuable when it's implemented properly. And I'll go back to the ABCs of, what I mentioned, applied behavioral science. Now, a game, why games fail as gamification is you say, I'm going to play a game to make sure people learn what to do. That is providing an antecedent. Gamification, in other words, rewarding people, a positive reward for a behavior, that's an example of applying a positive consequence. A gamification is the application of positive consequences for the desired behaviors. And you need to understand that's what true gamification is. If you just play a game, you're just providing information, albeit maybe a little bit more fun, maybe a little bit more engaging, but it's only going to have possibly 20% maximum impact compared to true gamification, which will have 80% or more impact for the desired behaviors. Safety science. I'm really a fan of how that we practice safety science. Really, what happens is at the end of the day, when you look at safety science, they have essentially taken like what's called new school safety science. They've looked at and studied human harm. In other words, how have injuries resulted from practices? And one of the things is safety science has clear financial motivation. And when people get injured in a factory setting or in any setting for that matter, there are hard financial costs. There's clearly the medical costs. There's potentially lawsuits. There's potentially shutting down of factories to stop and save the person, whatever the case may be. And when safety science has gone in and studied injuries, they find that 90% of injuries are from the environment. For example, somebody slips in the workplace. The person is otherwise acting appropriately, and something on the floor causes a slip, which is why we have those signs that say, wet floor, be careful, and that type of stuff. It's like sometimes people, like something falls on them. Sometimes equipment is bad and causes harm and so on. But when safety science looked at injuries, they find 90% of incidents can be addressed by improving the environment. The other 10% is from carelessness or ignorance. This is where possibly awareness training might fit in. But again, we have to start looking at safety science, and from a cybersecurity perspective, how can we improve the user environment so that they can behave more securely? I also pretty much go to just about every business function. Just imagine what would happen if a CFO walked into a board meeting and said, well, I hate to report, but we had a $50 million loss, and the loss resulted from a human action. And you know what? Don't worry. We can't blame the user. We gave them better awareness training, but, they'll never do it again. A CEO would look at the CFO and say, you have an accounting error that cost us $50 million. It's like, yeah, but, we retrain the accountant. It's like, oh, no, we don't blame the accountant. We blame you, because your job is to proactively anticipate where these losses are going to come from and proactively mitigate these losses. If you think it was too hard for you to go ahead and prevent a $50 million loss, you're not the right CFO for us. Likewise, a COO would be fired for like a factory floor for saying they can't get their employees to do their jobs properly. Those are issues that would never be accepted. People would be fired, not the employees, but the management would be fired for consistently bad behavior by the employees. McDonald's pretty much has automated away just about every employee decision. They have timers, for example, for their hamburger fryers so that the hamburgers come out identical from one batch to the other. They have timers for the French fries. They have machines that pour sodas that regulate the amount of ice inside things. They've taken away, employee decisions, which make for a consistent product again and again and again, which takes away the opportunity for errors. Yes, they still occur, but it's been significantly reduced. So what should an awareness program actually look like? It's really more than phishing and CBT, computer-based training. A lot of people, when you talk to them about awareness, it's like, well, I have a phishing program, I have computer-based training, so I put that all together. I run my phishing once a quarter. Everybody gets a monthly video. That's not awareness. A good awareness program has to be pervasive. There has to be a strategy for the awareness program, and phishing and computer-based training are tactics that might go there. Because remember, you're creating consistent behaviors. That's the goal. And the consistent behaviors create an overall culture. And, so that's the goal. And you're supposed to use any communication tool that could possibly work. We're talking bringing in speakers, newsletters. I've seen putting programs together where you have coffee cups and you put those little cardboard sleeves over them. You put messaging on there to reinforce messages. And anything else you can think of along the way is helpful. The two basics that you're really trying to go ahead and understand in order to implement an awareness program, you have to understand the culture. And I don't mean the security culture. I mean the overall corporate culture, because there is the security culture, which is how people specifically behave with regard to cybersecurity. But then there is the corporate culture, which is how do people behave across the entire organization. And so that is the culture. How do people communicate with each other? Do they use Slack? Do they use email? Do they like to go from, assuming they're back at work, walk from desk to desk to talk to each other and so on? Then you have to understand the business drivers. What is valuable to the organization? So when you look at the components of an awareness program, the topics are driven by the business drivers. In other words, specifically, why or, what do I need to tell my employees? What do I want? What type of cybersecurity awareness behaviors do I want to improve? Then the communication tools, how do I communicate the message, is driven by the corporate culture. So I'm basically trying to change the security culture by providing topics that are delivered in a way appropriate to the overall corporate culture. Then another part of the component that everybody needs to realize by default is metrics. And metrics are driven by your business drivers because they tell you what's important to measure. They're also driven by your culture. The culture basically tells you what is available to collect. So I would love to collect, for example, how do I know exactly what is the awareness level of an individual employee? Maybe I want to go ahead and deliver a social engineering simulation assessment once a month. but I probably don't have the resources. I don't have the time. I don't have the openness of the organization to say, yes, once a month, you're going to try to compromise each and every employee. It's just not doable. But your metrics are going to be driven by, again, what's important and what's available to measure. Metrics should try as best as possible to measure the root behaviors, not the symptoms. In other words, a phishing simulation, people clicking on that, that's one thing. I really care more about how many people report phishing messages. That's more valuable. On the other hand, anti-malware reports, in other words, how many incidents did the malware software, my malware software stop over a period of time? Because when you think about malware, how does malware get on your network? Typically, it's from unsafe web browsing. Maybe it's from sharing of files, from phishing messages, maybe it's from USB drives. All of those are awareness failings. So malware is getting on your network primarily through awareness failings. And if the malware incidents go up, it's a good measure that your awareness program's failing. On the other hand, if malware is going down, while it might not be as obvious, it's a good indication that awareness is generally working too, combined with your technical procedures. You might also, another behavior I like to mention are calls to the help desk that are security related. And everybody's like, well, if we have a good secure organization, we're not going to have incidents. I'm like, no, a secure organization is constantly finding incidents. Anybody who ever tells you if you don't have any reports of an incident, you have a really good security program, is 100% wrong. There's always going to be something going on. And if nobody's reporting it, they don't know what to look for. Or if they know what to look for, they're not reporting it so that it could be dealt with. The more reports you get to the help desk that are security related, the more aware your organization is. Can you stop strangers that come in and out? I do tailgating simulations sometimes where I pretend to be a person without a badge and try to follow people through. Do I get stopped or not? The more frequently I get stopped, the more aware the organization is. And ideally, awareness should have real business practices built in, not a simulation like simulated phishing or how many people attend my game or presentation. So at the end of the day, what I try to tell people you need to do is you need to create grandma's house. What's grandma's house? Everybody does the right thing because everybody does the right thing. The right thing is known to everybody. The right thing is passed on from one person to another. The culture is reinforcing a proper cybersecurity behaviors. That's the ideal type of awareness program, in my personal opinion. As I mentioned, and the implication is culture is your best awareness tool. Again, when everybody does the right thing, everybody's going to do the right thing. Yes, I realize that's a grandiose statement. It's not perfect, but yeah, people do the right thing because of everything else. And generally, you don't need an awareness program. When you walk around the RSA conference, for example, everybody's wearing a badge. Why do they wear a badge? Because the culture enforces it. There are people that make people wear badges to get up the escalators, as an example, in the exhibit halls. So again, the environment, the culture is reinforcing proper cybersecurity behaviors. And that's something we want to take and embrace and try to make our goal. And, at the end of the day, security awareness people have to remember, security is like every other business process. We want to try to remove decision-making from the users as best we can. We want governance to determine processes specifically, because a lot of people forget that, we shouldn't have discretion. Like, it shouldn't be, oh, well, should I click on this or should I not? Should I give information or should I not? There should be an established way of doing things. And we have to go ahead, and governance should be that way. We downplay and frequently don't mention what is governance when we're creating an awareness program. But the awareness program, like I mentioned before, with regard to creating Elmer Fudd's, we should be telling people how to do our job right, not what to be afraid of, not how to do it, not what to be afraid to do your job wrong, but basically, how do you do your job properly? And that should be the fundamental process of a security awareness program. Anyway, exception handling. One thing I always tell people, make sure that you have something, some way of handling exceptions. Tell people, look, we give you everything we possibly can, much like all business processes, but at some point, there's going to be something outside the norm. We accept not every situation is going to be perfect. So therefore, we expect you to say, hey, call your manager if you see something that is in question. Do something, call somebody, do something, report it, send it to security@company.com. Make sure there is a way to handle exceptions and people know that. So, like I keep joking about, which one are you creating? Are you creating Marines? And I'm not saying you want to go ahead and have create a military environment. Are you going to go ahead and have people who essentially go ahead and do the job right because that's the way to do the job? Or are you going to create Elmer Fudd's who are always on the lookout for the Wesley Wabbit? My preference, not to create a military environment in business, but you want to have people who generally go ahead, adhere to, here's how you follow the rules. So the big question, do you want an aware user or are you mitigating user-related losses? You are trying to mitigate user-related losses, whether or not a user is aware of what those losses are, how they're mitigated, or whatever. You need the right behaviors, good, bad, or indifferent, to accomplish the goals. Again, you have a holistic approach, and I'll leave it at that. So anyway, I do want to say and make sure everybody knows awareness is valuable, but in general, when we look at the Verizon data breach report, 1 in 20 users will fail. That's 50 people for every 1,000 users. And again, consider all it takes is one. So if a bad person sends a phishing message into your organization, it's a given that somebody will fall for that phishing message. Probably more than one if you don't have the right technology around. Now, the issue is when somebody says, hey, wait a second, no matter what happens, if somebody's going to fail, is that bad? As I told you, your goal's not perfection. If we can get, like the 1 in 20 users, if we say, okay, 1 in 20, what if we get it down from 1 in 20, which is pretty much 5 in 100 users? What if we get it down to 2 in 100 users? That means that we're reducing risk from user actions by more than 50%. We're not relying upon the user as our last line of defense. There's other technologies, but either way, we're reducing risk over time. And even if a user creates a failing, I would still rather have my organization deal with 10 incidents a year instead of 30 incidents a year. Because don't promise perfection, but we are reducing risk. And if you're not reducing risk, there's a problem. So again, what you need to do, reduce the need for awareness. Try to take away user action points. Try to take decisions away from users. People say that's bad. I don't think that's bad. It means you're going ahead and essentially reducing the workload of a user. Get them to do their necessary functions, but don't overburden them with decisions that are unnecessary for them to make. We don't necessarily want them to think. We want them to do their jobs repeatedly, consistently well. And the more decisions we take away from them, the better. So anyway, I'll just say, in the ideal world, what would you do? Go ahead, read Security Awareness for Dummies, or, You Can Stop Stupid, and figure out what type of awareness programs do you have in place, and really determine if you want to change what you have. Based on what I said, I don't think I'm the only person who's ever thought of this. You probably have some really good efforts in place. Which efforts can you repeat? Which can you, determine what can you go ahead and consistently do? And maybe think at a high level, how you want to enhance that. Within 30 days, determine a plan to start migrating from where you are to where you want to be. I'm not saying do it, but you start to get the plan determined. Then you go ahead and try to get support for the plan. And then over 90 days, create the final plan. And I try to tell people, determine the first project to enhance your awareness program. And I'm not saying, you're going to implement your whole program all at once, but figure out, just make one good change and start that and get things going. and start with, like, again, the proverbial low-hanging fruit. Just start fixing things. But again, start one good program that you can focus on. And like I said, obviously I have some awesome books that talk about this, which is why I'm qualified, I hope, to give a master class, because I've looked at this for way too long. So anyway, with all that being said, I want to thank you for your time, and let me know if you have questions.